Leading a church would be a lot easier without all these people. But we have to deal with them, and we're talking about that today on the Church Revitalization podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ?
Yes?
People can be a problem sometimes.
They sure can. Yeah. And last week we talked about a few other barriers to implementing positive changes in the church, and today we're tackling the big one. We needed a whole separate episode just for people problems.
Yes, people problems. And, you know, I would have to say if you are a more of an S, maybe an I, but certainly an S on the disc, you maybe have fewer people problems or different kinds of people problems. You usually get along well with other people. People like you. Those of us who are more on the D end of the spectrum can get annoyed with people. The Ds and the Cs can get a little annoyed from time to time with the folks.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can.
So, yeah, it depends a little bit on your personality. But even the S's and the I's don't handle conflict too well because they don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. So everybody has a little bit of something to learn, I think, when it relates to leading people. And so, like you said, AJ, today on this episode of the Church Revitalization podcast, we're talking about how do we lead people through change? How do we deal with people who who are resistant to change?
Yeah.
Before we dive into the 5 sort of steps or strategies to use to deal with this, I thought it might be worth starting with how do people break down? Like, what are people's natural orientation to change? And so the early adopters, there's some data that is discussed in, I referenced this in last week's episode, but I couldn't remember the book. I did the hard work of remembering, and it's this book, Pouring New Wine into Old Wineskins, by Dr. Aubrey Malfers. This resource, AJ, was a Your Church Magazine recommended resource in 1993. So,
Been a little bit.
It's been a little bit.
That one was out. Yeah.
Been a minute. The good news is that I don't think the psychology of humans has changed significantly since 1993. So I think
That's true. Yeah.
This at least is still relevant. So the data shows that between 10 and 20%, and I would imagine this just depends a little bit on the church or the group of people, but between 10 and 20% of a group of folks are going to be in that early adopter camp. 60 to 80% of your folks are going to be in that middle adopter group. So they'll get there eventually. 18% are late adopters. They will get there, but they're going to get there late.
Gonna be a while.
But when it comes to the never adopters, AJ, these are the folks who I don't care. I'm not doing it. I'm totally resistant to change. 2%.
2%. Yeah.
And how many churches have stopped a God-sized dream, a God-sized strategy, because of the opinion of that 2%?
Yeah. Yep. Sometimes things don't even get off the ground because of the fear that 2% in their minds is 50%.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. So I think it's maybe worth maybe a pre-step to the 5 things we're going to talk about today is just recognizing, and I mentioned this in last week's episode, just get over that mental barrier. Like you got to tell yourself as a leader, not everyone is against me. And sometimes what we see as these middle adopters who are maybe like skeptical, maybe just everyone who isn't an early adopter, we just go, oh, they'll never get on board. you got to rewrite that story in your brain. The reality is that 98% of the people will get where you're going on a different time scale. 2% will not go where you're going. Do not abandon your plans because of that 2%.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, this happens more. This is going to be a not a well-documented scenario, but I would expect that this happens way more than people might even imagine. That ideas are put forth, leadership teams talk about the future, and cut themselves off at the knees before things ever get started because of fear.
It's impossible to prove a negative, right?
True.
So we can't.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, we can't know, but it seems reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, having conversations with pastors, they're like, yeah, we've talked about that, or sometimes they say we've tried that and it didn't work. You have to kind of dig into what that was actually about. But yeah, I guess we would probably be addressing more of the "we tried it and it didn't work" group today than the we decided not to try it.
Yeah,
I think our points would apply to the tried it, didn't work, and a lot of these, if they had taken this advice, maybe it would have worked.
Yeah, for sure. And when I was on staff in churches, one of my least favorite things to hear in a meeting would be when someone says, well, people are saying, dot, dot, dot. And I'd be like, people? Who? Who specifically? Well, I don't want to share names. Okay, so was it a person or is it a whole group? You're like, well, it was a person. I'm like, oh, well, okay. Well, can I you're saying I can't talk to that person, or because if it's a problem with just that person, I'm not going to stop what we're doing for them. But I'd be happy to meet with them.
They told me in confidence, Scott.
Well, then I'm going to continue to walk forward with this plan in confidence. So, okay. All right. So I just want to I thought it would be maybe helpful to contextualize that when it comes to people who resist change, I mean, statistically, somewhere between 78 and 98% of your folks are going to be hesitant to change. But they're going to get there eventually. Only 2% of your folks are going to say, no, never.
There you go. Now, it doesn't mean you don't need a good plan.
Sure, right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's not the only barrier. We talked about other ones last week. So go back to episode 164 and listen to those. There are other reasons why things won't work out sometimes.
That's right. You can still screw this up, but we're hoping that you don't. Yes. Yeah. You can still, what is it they say? Clutch defeat from the jaws of victory or something? Yeah, snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Yeah, right. Okay, let's jump in here. So number one, all right, so we deal with people. So let's set this up super fast. We've got a plan. We have a vision for the future. We've put together a strategy, and people are grumbling. Okay, we're getting some resistance. Number one, you've got to push ahead. You just can't give in as soon as the people are talking, but it's actually just Joe, and he complains about everything. So we've got to move past that. We can't just retreat at the first sign of resistance. Moses dealt with this out, with the Israelites. They were resistant to change. They were grumbling. Yeah. That didn't work out well. And the people, a little bit into a season of change, a little bit into that is when that's going to happen. I mean, the Israelites, they weren't pretty excited when they got across the sea, right? But it wasn't too long after that they were like, uh-oh, this isn't good. Of course, they were complaining before that too, when the Egyptians were charging after them. And then they were like, it was a lot of highs and lows, wasn't it? Like, we're going to die. Let's surrender. Oh, right. God saved us. We can do anything. And then all of a sudden, can we have some meat? Can we have some water? Anyway, people are going to want to go back to Egypt. Egypt's going to be looking good in the rearview mirror. And it's up to us as leaders to remind them about the realities of Egypt and the promises of the future land that we will we will take and enjoy that God has put before us.
Yeah, such a good point. I think that it's always good, I think, to give context, and we're going to talk more about this later, but to just contextualize and say, change is inevitable. There's no such thing as status quo, because we can either be victims of change or we can have a voice in it, but things don't remain static. If we do nothing as a church, our community will still be different a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. This building will look different. Even if I don't actively make a mess in my house, it will still get dirty, right? Mm-hmm. Without any indirect input from me. So when people understand that to some degree, it gives you permission to say, I just need to push ahead because there isn't really an option where I'm doing nothing. I'm just choosing to actively reinforce the status quo, build up a wall around inertia and say, oh, we're going to just stay the same, or we're going to be proactive in accomplishing the Great Commission. So since you have to be active in some way, you might as well push ahead with the thing that you believe that God is giving your church to do.
Yep, that's right. Our second point is that we need to obviously always be respectful when people are resisting, but we also need to openly disagree with them. Mm-hmm. And so the scenario here is that, somebody is coming up, maybe they pull you aside. It's that one person that wanted to speak in confidence, right? That was going to force a staff member them to say, people are talking. That person, they pull you aside after church on Sunday and they're like, gosh, I just don't think this is a good idea. It'd be better if we did this or if we went back to what we were doing. And you can't let that hang then with, you know what? I totally see your point. I think and that's a valid argument. You have to say, really what we're doing is going to be better, and we're just not going to be going back to that, And I'm looking forward to how you're going to help us really make this happen and be great. So you can't let that stuff just hang out there, because you pull a few of those people have this magic way of finding each other and forming a group. Yeah. So 2, 3, 4 of those conversations where you left somebody kind of thinking, maybe there's a chance I could influence this where we go back to what we were doing. Those folks all of a sudden have a coalition, and you're like, oh, great. I wish I had nipped that in the bud.
Yeah, well, and not only that, but the 10 to 20% of early adopters that you have will go, what the heck? Like I thought we made a plan. What are you talking about? They made a good point. Are we actually considering going back to Egypt? Is that?
Yeah.
Why would you say that's a good point? It's not a good point, actually. Right? I've shared this story before. And I was in my 20s when this happened. So I would imagine I would execute it the same way, maybe with a little more finesse, with some age on me. I hope I would maybe have a little bit more tact. But, we had a thing that we did called Sent to Serve. I know a lot of churches do something similar where, when there's a month that has 5 Sundays, you take the 5th Sunday off from church, go and serve out in the community. And it was important to us early on, because this was when our church was new. We were just starting. We wanted to create a culture at the church where we weren't going to be wearing that the Sent to Serve Sundays wasn't intended to be an advertisement for the church. It was just to do good, like just to be kind to our neighbors. And so we didn't want to be wearing church t-shirts. We just wanted to be in regular clothes. And, later on we were more lax on this, but this was for our first event. And so we kind of wanted to set the culture early on that this is not an advertisement for the church. This is just to do right. And so we had a group of people who were meeting to help plan various projects around town. And one of the ladies said, well, the committee has decided that we are going to wear t-shirts. And I said, this is what I'm talking about, where we kind of had made a decision as a leadership team, this is where we're going. And then we have this ad hoc group, a smaller group, who was given a specific function, which was to plan projects. It was not to make decisions about t-shirts. It was to plan projects. And she said, the committee has decided we're going to wear shirts. And I said, first of all, we don't have committees here. You're a team that we've put together to plan projects. I said, and second of all, that's not a decision that you're empowered to make. We've already made a decision on this. We're not wearing these t-shirts. And she, probably twice my age, looked at me like I had 15 heads. And again, I hope at my age now, I maybe would have a little more finesse in how I said that. But I think I stand by how I handled it in principle. It would not have been good to tell her, hey, you know what? Let me run that back up the flagpole, let me run that back up the chain of command. We'll see. We'll get back with you on that. It would have totally undercut my role, my authority. It would have undercut. We had already been very clear on this. There wasn't a need to rehash it. The decision was made. So, I don't know. Maybe that's just a small example of the kind of thing we're talking about. I was not rude to her, but in the open, in front of the whole group, I said, no, that's not it. That's not how this is going to go.
Well, you brought up another good point, though, the avoidance tactic of deferring to someone else, as if you can't make that decision. You can't openly tell that person this is not what we're going to do, and you instead are like, well, let me check. Let me ask one more time, see if we can do that. You're just deflecting and trying to put the not the blame, but you're trying to put it on somebody else to say no.
Right. You're like, I was all for it, but that guy. Now there may be a situation where it's not really your call. Do you know what I mean? Where you really do go, man, I'm not sure. I'll need to check on that. I'm not talking about that. This was not that situation.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. All right. Let's keep going. So our number 3 is that we need to confront bad information and correct it whenever that's actually what's going on. So, and this is wholly appropriate for our day and age, isn't it? With bad information, misinformation. I'm not sure what the difference is between misinformation and disinformation, but maybe there's some nuanced difference.
I think I think that misinformation is
like accidental.
Yeah. Okay. Disinformation is intentionally telling someone the wrong thing. Right. It's wrong, but you're trying to disinform them.
Yeah, that could be it. So anyway,
if you find those words triggering, ignore them. The point is when there's bad information, correct the information. I give an example in this week's article the same church, when we were planting, when we were building a permanent facility, there were some local neighbors who had it in their brains, like someone had told them that we were putting a school in the church building that we were going to build. I don't know where they had gotten that. No one had ever even suggested that. It just was, so they had in their minds that there were going to be like long lines of kids and families coming in every morning. It's a 2-lane road that's right there next to where the church was going to be. So they were thinking, we're not going to be able to get to work in the mornings. It's going to be a zoo. It just wasn't true though. Like that was not, there was no plan to put in a school. And so, they were fighting against us putting the building there until we told them we're not putting in a school. And they were like, oh, never mind. Never mind. Yeah.
So, one of the best ways to deal with this is on the front end, though. Communicate clearly with detail and transparency. Lay out what the plan is and answer questions up front and, have good documentation, publicize for whatever is appropriate towards whatever you're doing, because that'll go a long way. It'll certainly narrow down what people might be able to create that goes against what you've said.
Yeah. And just gossip. Gossip happens in church.
Yeah.
So just, you need to have your ear to the ground on what's the word on the street. And any sort of...
That's a segue into our next point, really, not to tolerate sinful behavior.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So there
I
you go.
was just going to say, I think that, well, just to go back on point number 3 for a second, I think that sometimes it's not sinful. It's just a rumor, and so maybe it is gossip and that is sinful. But I think that if you're saying something and you believe it because you heard it and you thought it was true, it isn't the same as intentionally spreading some sort of a lie, which is a different situation. I'm working with a church right now that I've been working with for a long time. And, we're regularly encountering, what they've been calling bad narratives. Like where did you get this story? Like what? Why have you been telling yourself this? That's not true. And so they've been spending months just unwinding, unraveling these years of just bad stories. And so which has led to point 4, which has led to some sinful behavior. But it didn't start that way. It just started with misunderstanding. So, all right. So let's move on. Number 4, don't tolerate sinful behavior.
Yeah, right. I mean, things that they begin to move into that realm. People are doing destructive things or using destructive narratives, self-serving things. These absolutely have got to be stopped ASAP. Those people have got to be, corrected and or disciplined if it's, bad enough, I suppose. Because that stuff is a cancer for sure.
Totally.
And they'll suck more people in with them. So,
yeah. One of my favorite passages, and if I've ever been to your church and you've invited me to preach, there's a decent chance I've preached on this passage because I love to preach on this passage. But in Nehemiah chapter 2, the work on the rebuilding the wall has not happened yet. Nehemiah is just getting started. He's sharing the vision with the people, and he's sharing kind of what God has provided in order to accomplish this vision and accomplish this goal of rebuilding the wall. And so in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 19, it says, But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Now, everything that they just said is just patently false, and they know it's false, because if they had heard what Nehemiah had just said, they are attacking his motives, and they are intentionally saying things that they know are untrue. So that's a key thing here, that this is sinful behavior on behalf of these people. It is not a misunderstanding. They are not late adopters. They are not middle adopters. These are that 2% who have their own agenda and motives. And so how does Nehemiah respond to them? He says, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. I mean, he's basically saying, get out.
Yeah, right.
Get out. And I know that that's harsh, but if you've got people based on your personality, you might think anybody who has a criticism is like Sanballat the Horonite. You should not assume that. You should assume that most people who are maybe a little bit skeptical, that they're going to come along eventually. But there are some people, those 2% of people, who are they're going to be divisive, they're going to work against you, they're going to be sinful. And I think you have to treat them like Nehemiah does and say, get out. You have no portion, you have no right, you have no claim in what God is doing here. And that's harsh. And it's rare, or it should be. But it has to be done sometimes.
Yeah, unfortunately. All right, our last point today is that people need to be exposed to reality. And this is something we would certainly encourage, especially churches that we work with. We would encourage this on the front end. So, I mean, we're talking about it last today, but when you're expressing vision for the church and laying out strategies for positive changes that you're going to make, exposing people to the reality of today is an important aspect of that. I would never lead with what's wrong. I would lead with what's good that we're going to. But then to back that up, we have to talk about, why can't we stay here? What's wrong with doing the same thing over and over? And so when people begin to understand the reality of what's happening today and where, without these changes, where we're headed, and there is a trajectory that you're on, then that goes a long way in gathering more people in a positive way that want to support what you're doing. So make sure you have good information that backs up the reason for doing something different, the why behind it. There's going to be kind of a positive side, two sides of the same coin. What's the positive side of the why? Why are we going to do this new thing? Well, let me tell you about how great things will be. Flip side of that coin, let me tell you why we're doing this new thing, about what's wrong with what's happening today. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be the strategy, the communication strategy that's going to gather the most people and minimize that 2%.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this to me is the critical element. Going back to, say, Nehemiah for a second. Oh no, I shut my Bible and I've lost my spot. But in Nehemiah, he says, let us rebuild. Let me get the quote right. He says, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned." And just period. It's a declarative statement. You see the trouble. Things are not good. And then he says, "Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision." Aren't you guys tired of being the punchline to every joke? Aren't you tired of this lack of feeling of safety? Don't you want to feel safe in your own city? Aren't you tired of Jerusalem not being the city on the hill that God designed and desires this place to be? Don't you want it? Don't you believe this place is made for more? So he's pointing out what's bad. These walls, they've been in ruins for over 100 years at this point. And we're all just going to be okay with these ruins around us. We're going to live in ruins. That's what we're going to do. And so he points out the problem. He gives them a picture of the future. We're no longer going to suffer derision. And then he gives them a plan. And I think this is so important. This is what leaders do. Leaders remind people of the stakes. What's at stake? If there are no stakes in your church, do not expect people to follow you anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, why does Frodo leave the Shire? What? There's got to be stakes. Why does Luke leave Tatooine? There's got to be stakes. It doesn't matter. In every story, there has to be stakes. If your church has to have stakes, there's got to be something at risk. And if people don't feel that viscerally, they're never going to go where you're going.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hey, if you're listening right now to the Church Revitalization podcast, you likely are in a position in which you might find a lot of commonality with Nehemiah. Your church today in 2022 might seem a lot like Nehemiah's Jerusalem. And so, there's a reason Scott likes to preach on that. It's wholly applicable to churches going through revitalization. So I'd encourage you to go back and check out at least the beginning of Nehemiah, whenever the project was getting kicked off and what led up to it, and how he relates to the people about what their present situation is, because that is good stuff, no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite passages. So again, I apologize if you invite me to your church. I'm still probably going to preach on Nehemiah too. It's a trusted passage for me in working with churches.
Well, there you go. 5 ways, or not necessarily 5 ways, but 5 situations of people barriers that you may come across when you're trying to implement positive changes in your church going forward, and we hope you are. We hope you're making some plans to do that. This was 165. This is episode 165 of the Church Revitalization podcast. Crazy, Scott, that we're up to this such a number. So you can go to malforsgroup.com/165 and read today's show notes. There's the link to the YouTube version in there as well, where you can see our smiling faces. Hi. Looking back at you as you're listening. And maybe you even go through this one with your team, your leadership team. If you're on we're in November 2022, maybe January, you're like, we're going to roll out some new things. Now's the time to arm yourselves with ways to handle the pushback that you inevitably will get, but probably from a smaller group than you might be afraid of today. So there you go. Thanks for being with us. If you would like to support the Malfers Group and the nonprofit ministry that we do around the world, go to malfersgroup.com/donate, and you can learn more information there. We're glad you were with us. We'll see you again next week.